Hello, I am on with Ellen Reed, state representative for Newmarket and Newfields, New Hampshire, and she's running for state representative again in New Hampshire. And I have her on to talk about what she's done for ranked choice voting in the state.
Yeah, so I am the first ever prime sponsor of ranked choice voting in New Hampshire. I first sponsored it in 2018, and I've sponsored it every term since then, sometimes twice a term, depending on whether we were allowed. I've prime sponsored it 8 times. When I first put it in, it was actually before Maine actually had passed theirs. And with the exception of, I think after my third or fourth attempt, a colleague of mine put in a constitutional amendment proposal. With the exception of that, I am the only ever prime sponsor of ranked choice voting in New Hampshire.
Okay, yeah. And so what does that mean for the layman in the audience for you to have sponsored that bill and to be the only sponsor of that bill?
Right. So being a prime sponsor means it was my idea. I'm the one that put in the request to have it drafted as a bill. I'm the one that was in charge of what that final language would look like as a bill. There are co sponsors who add their names to show support for the bill, but they don't necessarily lead the charge
Hmm.
almost ever. So they may do things occasionally to help out, like show up and testify. But in general, the prime sponsor is the captain of the ship, so to speak.
Okay. And for a bill that gets more attention, does that normally have multiple prime sponsors, different prime sponsors over the years?
If you're talking about let's take cannabis legalization,
Hmm.
something really popular like that, that's had multiple different prime sponsors over the years. The number of co-sponsors a particular bill has really is up to the prime sponsor who they want to add, and of course the co-sponsors themselves. So if it's something that's not popular, you may not see a lot of people signed on to support, or maybe the prime sponsor just didn't bother to add them. But yeah, I've always had, I think, a full slate or almost full slate of 10 reps prime or co-sponsoring my prime sponsored ranked choice voting bills.
Okay. So how much would you say pushback or have you gotten? Is there any pushback or is it just that a lot of people don't know about this idea?
The answer to both of those is yes. There is a significant amount of pushback from both sides. Actually, I think it didn't used to be the case that this was seen as a partisan issue, but like most things in our very polarized world, everything is seen as having to be black or white, red or blue, and this ended up falling on the blue line. So for the Republican Party, it's seen as let me use their exact phrasing. It was recently called by the Republican Party in New Hampshire a liberal voting scheme.
Ah, okay.
This, of course, in opposition to the fact that it has been operational in other countries, very conservative Western democracies, for over 100 years.
Hmm.
Australia used it, started using it on the national level over 100 years ago. Ireland uses it. These are, as Western democracies go, these are relatively conservative. Also, they are calling it a liberal voting scheme, despite the fact that the Utah GOP, for example, has used it for over 20 years. The Libertarian Party has used it internally for over 20
Hmm.
years, and other state GOP parties have been using it to internally select their candidates. I think it's Illinois and also definitely Virginia. Virginia famously used the first time they started using ranked choice voting in their internal elections to select candidates. They actually were very successful in selecting a candidate that ended up upsetting the Democrat.
Oh yeah.
So the thing is that ranked choice voting gives a high definition picture of the will of the electorate. And so internally, conservatives and Republicans really like it. But on a national level, if they are worried that actually the will of the public might be a
Mm.
little bit to the left of what our current political realities are, they would not favor it because it would mean that the people being elected would be more representative of actually what people want.
Right. And that is what I found for the most part that I like about ranked choice voting is that is potentially, at least hypothetically, something you can talk to people across the political spectrum about and get support for. But I've also been finding it hard to find, maybe with the massive exception of the Libertarian Party, proponents on the right of ranked choice voting.
Right. Well, I will say, in places where it's been instituted, you will find a lot of regular rank and file Republicans who appreciate it. For example, the state Senate majority leader, Republican, kind of establishment Republican in Alaska, was initially, when ranked choice voting was being proposed there, was initially very skeptical and very against it,
Mm.
and now is one of its strongest supporters in Alaska. And she actually spoke at the NHRCV meeting that we had to talk about that fact. Also, the Republican Secretary of State in Maine, when it was instituted, was also opposed to it.
Mm.
And he very famously shifted gears afterwards, saying, actually, this was a very smooth process. People understood how to do it. We didn't have problems counting. All of the fear mongering really was not based on anything. So where there are Republicans already using it,
Mm.
you will find that it's not there's no skepticism anymore. But the reason that you find this kind of political divide, and it's not just in Republicans. I find most of the or a lot of the establishment side of the Democrats are also very skeptical. And this just is that tendency to want to stick with what's always been done
Right.
and not really open to learning about different things. And I don't even want to call it new because, again, it's been used for over 100 years. Yeah. But in their minds, it's this newfangled. You might as well be talking about AI or something, But it's that kind of skepticism. But really, the reason you're going to experience backlash from party structure is because we all know the vast majority of people hate the two-party system. They hate the fact that they feel forced into voting for the lesser of two evils. They hate the fact that they can't vote their conscience if they preferred an independent or a third-party candidate. Well, they have to vote for one of these two major parties, because in our current system, which is called first past the post, is how we address our current system. Really only two parties ever matter, or only two candidates ever matter, and that's the person in the lead and the person closest to beating the person in the lead. And anything else is considered a spoiler, right? You're either spoiling the one party or the other, one of the two front runners. So what ranked choice voting does is it allows people to vote their conscience without penalizing their next preference. And because of that, it is the strongest tool in the toolbox for overcoming the two-party system. And that's why you're going to have a lot of establishment party people on both sides pushing back.
So that's actually a good sort of a segue, I think, because you're talking about status quo bias and an orientation towards change. And I wanted to ask you, you said you were one of the most productive legislators. I forget how you phrased it.
So prolific. So pretty much I've always been prolific in terms of the number of bills that I prime sponsor. They tell you the first term that you get in office to not, and by they, I mean the party leaders, tell you to not put in any bills your entire first term. So literally you went around to the people in your district, knocked doors, told them that you wanted to see change and here's how you're going to change things. And they believed what you said and they sent you to go do the job. And then you get there and the party goes, no, don't do any of the things you promised your people you would do. So my very first year of my first term, I put in 2 bills, and that was like my baby year. That's my, little baby steps.
Yeah.
My second year, I put in 8 bills, and it's been over that ever since. It's been like 12, 14. And then this particular term, Legiscan, which is a site that monitors state legislators across the country, they deemed me the most prolific in terms of the number of bills. State legislator in New Hampshire for the last 2 years. Last year I put in 16. In the first year of the term I put in 14 bills.
So do you think that is like a good metric for a good legislator? Because one of the things I've wondered about when I hear people talk about politics, it's seen as definitely a good thing, right? So I wonder, is it true that the more bills get passed, right, the more change. I assume that's all change,
Every
right?
bill is a change, right?
It
Because you're
is.
taking law and you're changing it. So it's definitely an important metric.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the only metric by any means. But I think, especially in this state where we don't pay our legislators, so we have a volunteer legislature, and that
Mm.
sounds really nice. That phrase sounds
It
lovely.
does sound.
The problem with that is that you end up getting only people who can afford to spend, whatever amount of time they want to spend on this endeavor. And usually what that means is independently wealthy,
Mm.
usually retired, older, I'm sorry, but it is true demographically, old white rich men
Yeah.
is what we have at the state house. I'm not sure about this term, but I think it was last term. The average age was 67. So these are people who kind of like they're already they won. They have their house, they had their kids have kids, they have their retirement, they won. So they're not really in touch. A lot of them are business owners or landlords. They're not really in
Mm-hmm.
touch with working class interests in this state, which is the vast majority of people in the state, right? And
Mm-hmm.
most people have to work. So if someone in my district steps down and I want to replace that with a legislator who's really going to work and understand working class interests, I can go to like someone your age or, some just regular average person. And most of them will have to tell me, no, I don't have the time to run
Yeah.
because I need to get paid. The analogy I use for that is if I were to come to New Hampshire and want to start a business, and I said, I need to hire 400 of the best and brightest that I can absolutely make this business the most successful that I can, and I can pay you competitively for your time, I would get a decent pool of applicants to select from.
Mm-hmm.
But if I said, I need 400 of the best and brightest and I can't pay you, I'm going to get 400 wackadoodles.
Yeah.
And that's kind of who's been in charge of the state. And the sad thing is we were never supposed to be unpaid. It's the reason we're $200 per biennium is because that got put in the Constitution in the 1800s. But at the time it got put in the Constitution, it was basically a meager laborer's wage. It was enough to buy 4 acres and a house at the time.
Mm.
So really you could serve one term and essentially have a modest but lifelong ability to take care of yourself after that. And now we've changed the narrative from being a modest salary, but at least it's a livable salary, to volunteer legislature. And isn't that great? Because now, and the sad thing is the people who are, for the most part, the people who are holding those seats right now, they don't want young, competitive, energized people. And all of that is to say that in my estimation, after 8 years there, the average state legislator, especially state rep, I guess, they kind of just show up and do nothing. It's more about the title. It's more about, someone came up to them and recruited them to run, and they own a business or whatever, and somebody goes and says, hey, everybody knows your name in town, you should run. You're important. And they're like, yeah, I am important. And they show up. They don't sponsor bills. The average number of bills a person puts in there is 1. And that means that half of them don't put in any. They barely show up for their own committees, especially for hearings. They might show up to vote in those committees, but that means they're voting on bills that they weren't in the hearing for.
That's terrible. And
they just are listening to their party leadership, how they should vote. And sometimes, a lot of them have a problem actually showing up to session days and have pretty poor attendance, but they definitely don't go speak. They don't go testify. They don't write bills. They don't do anything. And I have never heard of a voter wanting someone to go into office, but don't change anything and don't do anything. And that's sadly like the majority of the people there. So when we talk about, this is a metric, number of bills you put in, it really is about how serious is this person about seeing change? How serious are they about doing the work? There are other metrics in terms of like maybe the percentage of bills you actually get passed in terms of effectiveness, or what kinds of bills you put in. Do you put in like road naming bills, or do you put in deep systemic change bills?
Right.
So there's all kinds of ways a person can measure a legislator, but that was the very long answer to say why the number of bills is an important metric.
And I'm glad you brought that up too, because I actually had a previous guest on, John Kuiper.
Oh yeah, he's my constituent, and he and I are a bit of a team.
Absolutely, yeah, and he brought that issue forward, and
That was
I
me. I
that
told
was
him to
you.
make it an
You
issue.
told him to make it an
Yeah.
issue.
Yeah. I was working with him a year and a half before he ran, before he announced that he was running. And he told me he was interested. And like we went through issues. I'm like, this is why we don't see change in this state.
I'm glad you did that because I'm actually someone who ran for state rep in
Yeah.
this state, basically because somebody from the party needed someone to run. They were
Hmm.
worried they were going to lose a seat. They reached out to me. They're like, "Hey, you're young. Do you want to run?" And I ran, and I found that it was going to be an enormous obligation. I was even told by many of the Democrats around me, they were like, "Why are you running? You have a job."
Hmm. Yeah.
That's what they said. They would say, "You have a full time job. I'm not sure you're going to be able to serve the people of New Hampshire in this position."
In my second term, I was told I was passed up for chair of my committee because I had a job.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's
I'm
a
like, that's so
problem.
weird because I'm working way harder than a lot of these retired people. Like,
Hmm.
I started the Progressive Caucus. I prime sponsor like at least 10 bills a year. I don't know. I'm working pretty hard.
Right? If the problem was that the job was going to be an obligation, clearly you've overcome that obligation.
Right. And I also have one of the best attendance records.
I like to say that what we need is not a volunteer legislature, but a layman legislature. Because I'm
Right.
fine with
A
ordinary
represent
people in government.
what House of Representatives should be representative.
Hmm.
Fancy that.
Exactly.
Yeah, so it is a problem. And I so many times have said if people knew who was in charge of the state, how the state with the shenanigans that go down in the circus that is the state house, I feel like there would be riots in the streets because it's I don't know, it seems like every session or every, big bill is just another drama. But that's me being maybe a little bit too honest. I don't know.
Well, since you brought that up, I thought I would ask about this. Um, I noticed that a lot of legislation is very part time. Like, even aside from the fact that we have a volunteer legislature in New Hampshire, it seems like it's largely a part time job. Is that a problem for the productivity of our government? Should we want our legislators to be more full time?
So this job is literally whatever someone makes of it. I would say most legislators don't really do too much. And so it's even as part time, it's part time of part time because even when
Mm.
we're in full time mode, so to speak, it's still like they're not fully into it. But if you are very active, you're active throughout the year. You're doing constituent services throughout the year. You are a full time, you can never take off for that entire term your title of state rep. You
Mm.
should always be accessible to your constituents. Always, I make use of the research department constantly throughout the entire year. There's always stuff happening, and even when the 2 months that we have that's supposed to be off, and then we have fall, which is usually pretty like low level activity at the state house. Even then, there's stuff happening. So it's not actually a part time position. It's that if people don't max out and really give it their all, the work that they put in is not 40 hours a week.
Right.
In fact, I would say most weeks for most reps, it's probably zero.
Are there ways to, through policy, guarantee that our representatives are working more consistently? Do you think?
Well, I think that's a really tough question because
Mm.
ultimately the test has to be what do the voters want, right? And unless you put some sort of regulations on who could run for office and be legitimately elected, like, I don't know, I suppose, well, one of the bills that I've put in actually might
Okay.
help, and that was recall elections.
Okay.
Being able to say, you know what, we hired this guy, we don't like this guy, we
Mm.
want to fire this guy.
Hmm.
And certainly with the kind of legislature we have, every term we have people who are getting arrested and getting
Mm.
into really like terrible scandals. Very famously, an abuse of federal funds out of a
Okay.
couple of or one of the members and another former member using PPP loans to buy like sports cars and things.
Oh,
And
that's
yeah,
not
yeah,
good.
yeah, no, really nasty stuff that really, I think any doesn't matter about Republican or Democrat at that point. you should want them gone.
Yeah.
So that would have helped. But of course, once again, I'm running into the same problem. I do a lot of election reform stuff. So I
Hmm.
do like election day holiday and all these things. And it's
Right.
the same problem, whether it's campaign finance reform or national popular or whatever, that both parties, if you're in office right now, inherently what that means is that you have benefited, you've been put into power by the status quo,
Mm.
which means you have a vested interest in protecting that status quo. So people, even though if it doesn't work for really anyone else, because you benefited, you want to stay in power and you want that system to continue. And so I find the establishment of both parties very reticent to see any of these reforms, including recall elections, because
Mm.
that would mean that they would be available to be recalled whenever they made a big, boneheaded maneuver.
Yeah. So it sounds like if we want our politicians to be working more or less full time, really we just need better politicians, and that means accountability, recalls, stuff like that.
Right. Well, we could technically, another thing we could do is technically change it to an actual job. Because
Hmm.
right now, whilst the federal government does consider us employees, we get a W 2.
Okay.
For our $200 for the 2 years, we get a W 2 that has federal taxes taken out.
Okay.
So the federal government considers it a job, but the state of New Hampshire absolutely does not want, they will not honor it as a job at all. Even will not. And I actually put in the bill, one of the bills that I put in, and I actually had somebody else prime sponsor it for me, but I wrote it. And that was allowing our public service to count as public service for public service student loan forgiveness, which is a federal
Yeah.
program.
Okay.
Because if you want younger people, you have to give them something, and this is public service.
Yeah.
So why shouldn't it be considered public service for the public service loan forgiveness program? It's no
Right.
skin off of New Hampshire's teeth. We're not paying for it, right?
Yeah.
So, and in fact, all of the other states, pretty much with almost with no exceptions, their state legislators, even though they get paid,
Yeah.
they get, like, if you're in Massachusetts, you're getting 85,000 as a state rep.
Hmm.
They get public service loan forgiveness.
Wow.
We get no money, and we don't even get our public service, our student loans forgiven. And doing that would actually at least give some incentive to young people to run.
So I know you're running again. So tell me some of the other issues outside of ranked choice voting that you feel are the important issues right now.
Right. So thank you. So my whole thing on
Hmm.
all of my signs are kind of a thing in my district. I don't believe in signs that just, increase name recognition and
Hmm.
expect you, the voter, to vote for me because you recognize my name. I'm like, I want to educate people as to who I am. And if you don't like who I am, then that's how, you don't vote for me. That's how
Mm.
democracy is supposed to work.
I like
But
that.
at least you're an educated voter. Right. So on all of my signs, ever since the very first election, when they were still spray painted signs because I had no money, it says people, planet, principles, because that's kind of how I break down my policy areas.
Okay.
So people is more or less economic justice issues. So one of my super big issues is housing. I've also done labor issues and stuff, but especially the last 2 to 3 years, the last 2 years, it's just this last term, I put in 11 housing bills. So that's things like restricting what landlords can do to tenants and making the rental market more fair. Also increasing people's ability to buy housing, because I think a lot of the solutions to the housing crisis that people are talking about now is super focused on rental, but really the gold standard needs to be most people want to own their own home.
Hmm.
And that's what's actually going to bring workers long term here, is the ability to own. And it increases basically every metric in a community. The more home ownership you have, the better everything across the board is in your community. Even so, a community that is lower income but has higher home ownership has better outcomes on a lot of the metrics than a very affluent community that's mostly renters,
Okay, that actually makes a lot of sense.
because people
It's
are invested.
stability.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. People are invested. This is their home now. They are invested in the school. They're invested in the parks. They're invested in the town government. Whereas a renter, they come and they leave.
Mm.
So, I had 11 bills. I think last time I heard, the average success rate for a bill passing is like 1 in 10. Out of those 11 housing bills, I had 30 overall bills. Out of the 11 housing bills, two of the housing bills passed. They were maybe some of the more drop in the bucket ones, unfortunately, because
Mm,
big ideas take a long time to see progress. One was allowing victims of domestic violence out of their lease.
okay.
So landlords were able to keep people who were being stalked or people who were living with their abuser and wanted to leave, able to keep those tenants in their lease and
Mm,
prevent them from being able to leave. This is something that even very conservative states do, is allow them to leave. So happy to report that I put that in and got that passed, and it's
nice.
signed and it's law now. And then the other one that I'm really excited about, that I think will affect a lot of renters, is rental application fees have become extremely predatory. It used to be you'd pay maybe $25, $35 to apply to rent a unit.
Mm,
And that would cover generally the cost of a background or credit check and maybe some very minor administrative fees, printing, whatever. Because we had a 0.6 vacancy rate, that meant tenants were desperate and applying to, in some
mm,
cases, dozens of places. Landlords, literally, in some cases, wouldn't even have a unit available. They would just have pictures of an empty unit online. And these
oh,
people are so desperate that they would just put in the application. So, landlords were starting, it got up to about $250 per adult moving
wow.
in. So you're looking at maybe $500 or more. And then on top of that, they started charging holding fees up to $1,000. So if you didn't move in by the date, then they would just rent it to someone else and keep your holding fee. And on top of that, they were starting to charge brokerage fees of up to $1,000, all because these people were so desperate.
Yeah.
You had them where you wanted them.
They're making money literally off of the idea that they might get housing.
Right, right, exactly. In an environment where everyone's desperate for housing. So they were also starting to charge renewal fees, which is kind of wild. So you've already applied. They
Mhm.
did your background and credit check. You've lived there for 12 months. There have been no problems at all. And they're like, yeah, but still you have to pay to renew your lease.
Wow.
So what I did, and this bill went through several different amendments before we got to the final version. By the way, just for the record, a lot of other states in the teens somewhere do regulate the amount of a rental application fee. A couple states actually ban them outright because every other industry has to kind of eat the cost of bringing on new customers. So why would being a landlord be any different? And
Right.
certainly, like, if you don't subscribe to a service, which most landlords do, and it's even cheaper, but if you don't subscribe to a service, a background or credit check is about $10.
Okay.
Like, you
Yeah.
can
Yeah.
right now get online and pay $10 and get a background or credit check on somebody. And so it's kind of obscene that they wouldn't be able to just eat that cost, because you would obviously make it up in your first month's rent
Yeah.
easily. But what the bill does in the final version is it doesn't limit how much they can charge, but it says within 30 days that landlord has to show what they spent on a background check, a credit check, and a reasonable administrative cost.
Hmm.
And anything that they didn't spend and have the receipts for, they have to refund to that prospective tenant.
Okay. Yeah.
So, and even if it's not applied perfectly, what that will do is it really removes the incentive for landlords to charge these exorbitant fees, because they know that there's probably going to have a whole bunch of work to then produce receipts and then refund it in a month. So there really wouldn't be a reason for them to charge more than like $35 anyway.
I think that's great because when I've talked to people about housing, I don't hear necessarily about the nitty gritty of it so much, and I haven't heard about that issue. And I worked at a shelter for a while, and I volunteered with the homeless for a couple of years. And one of the things that I noticed was that the barrier to entry for going from homeless to in a home was not so much money as getting a job, getting a house. And so it's literally the either applying with the government to get your ID, or sending out the application to the job, or sending the application to the house that you're trying to rent from. It's the bureaucracy at every step in the process that people just give up and they become unmotivated by the bureaucracy, and they can't even get access to the resources in the first place. So removing those barriers is amazing.
I am so very extremely familiar with that. I actually come from a very, very poor family in South Memphis. And like I lived in a condemned home growing up,
Yeah.
without plumbing or heat. So there's a unworthy poor stigma that poor people must be doing something wrong. There must be something inherently flawed if you're in poverty, because obviously we live in a perfect meritocracy that if you just, work hard and do the right things, then you'll be rewarded financially in this system, which I think people are starting to realize isn't the case.
Yeah.
That it is very much who you know and what you've had access to. But what I can tell you from growing up in poverty and in impoverished neighborhoods is that poverty is a cycle. Once you get in it, like they say, it takes money to make money. Once you get in it, you don't have any resources anymore to pull yourself out. There are no bootstraps, right? And so what that leads to, because sometimes these people that have these kind of negative views of poverty, they think, oh, well, look, they're using drugs, or they don't realize that that is an actual symptom, not necessarily the cause. It's a loop. But the problem is the overarching experience of poverty is one of despair. Those bureaucratic systems that are set up, they're often set up, I think, maybe sometimes intentionally to be really confusing. I've found that like the really interesting tell, and this kind of goes back to the legislator that gamed the federal funds for PPP and ended up buying sports cars. Whenever a new program, a socialist program, if you will, is created, a fund for people, the first people in line who know how to apply, know who to talk to, the first people with their hand out are wealthy people that know how to game the system. And it's usually because their buddies are the lobbyists that were the ones that structured the system to begin with, right? So they're like, they know exactly how to do it. Meanwhile, people who are, living in Section 8 housing, on food stamps, they don't know they don't know how to, they're like, why don't you just start a business? They don't know how to start a business. Who do you call to start a business? Like, what do you do? They don't know these things. There was a book in the 90s called Rich Dad, Poor Dad. And I think people are very familiar with, and this is just something that it really resonates with me. People are really, really familiar with the idea, well, if you grow up wealthy or even upper middle class, then you have resources, right? You have, education, someone buys a car for you, all those things. But really, it's so much more than that. Because if you grow up in a neighborhood where your dad and your mom are business owners, or they're doctors or lawyers, and then your neighbors and your aunts and your uncle, all of those people, you always have someone who can give you advice on buying a house. You always have someone who can give you advice on what to study in school, or what to,
It's the network. It's
yes.
People, it's your friend who gets you a job.
It's just, well, right. It's not just the network, though. It's just the concept. It's first of all the concepts that you're being steeped in information about money management, about how to be wealthy. There's that. Like if you grew up in a household of mechanics, you may not end up being a mechanic, but I bet you know how to change oil. You know what I mean? Like, and if you're surrounded by people who know how to make money, you know things. You just grew up around that information, but it's more than that. It's the reality in your mind. I grew up in Memphis. Like I said, there's no, like you get like 1 inch of snow and there's no mountains for hundreds of miles. Okay. Skiing was a thing that I knew actually existed in the world. I saw it on TV. So it's not that I didn't think it was real, but in my heart, viscerally, it wasn't really real. It was a thing that happened on movies, right?
Yeah.
And it's very similar to the idea of starting a business, buying a home, getting a degree, and getting a good job. Because when you're growing up in a neighborhood of poverty, not only do you not have those resources we talked about, not only do you not have that, information everywhere in your culture that we talked about, but it just doesn't even seem real. It doesn't seem like it actually is going to happen. It's not viscerally real in your body. The people who have the most money are drug dealers.
Yeah.
So the idea that you can go start a business and go make it rich or whatever doesn't feel real. And so you end up being despaired. And to bring it all the way back around, when you end up in a culture of despair because you don't know the system, you don't have resources, you don't have that information that other people just seem to have been born knowing,
Mm-hmm.
and you don't have the sense that it ever is a possibility, you end up drowning your sorrows, drowning your sense of hopelessness in whatever substance or whatever activity. And then rich people get to look at you and go, see, you're worthless. You didn't know how to make it. So it is something that's definitely very, close to my heart. Sorry for that long explanation.
No, no, that's one thing I always say when talking about politics. Some people will try to come up with frameworks of what is the left, what is the right, right? Is it freedom versus big government, things like that. Whenever I hear somebody talk about equality on the left, I'm always like, I'm not sure that is what it's about. I'm like, I think it's about opportunity.
Yeah.
That's the way I phrase it. It's about creating opportunities for people. And that's exactly, you go out and you give somebody a job. I know so many people who were unemployed, especially at the shelters, right? Who were unemployed for like 9 months or something, or a year or two even. And they were unemployed for like forever, and they were completely destitute for that reason. They had no source of income. Somebody gave them a job,
Right.
just complete opportunity, just fell out of the sky, filled their name out on the paperwork for them because they didn't know how to do it properly, right?
Mm-hmm.
The second they got that job, they show up to work every single day and they work their ass off, and now they have money coming in.
Yeah.
So
And then we see this over and over again. For the longest time, there were structures for international aid that basically put a bunch of middlemen in between the people donating money and the people who would be receiving money, and that ended up being super ineffective. And it turned out when you directly gave money straight to the people, they knew best how to use it and actually ended up with the best outcomes. UBI, turns out when you give people the money directly, they actually use that, right? And they use it in the best way for themselves. All across Europe, I'm struggling with the phrase, but it's something like housing first or home first or something like that. And
Yeah.
it's the idea that you can't have kind of strings attached to housing. You can't be like, well, you better play by our rules or else you're going to be homeless, because it just doesn't work for people. That really you have to ensure the housing first before you can even address like what healthcare needs do they need, what mental health care needs do they need, what like job skill needs do they have. Like you need to like build them up, kind of like, because really when I go back to that Rich Dad Poor Dad, I really think of our structure, and this kind of also goes to the definition for me of left versus right. If you're even a middle class family and you go off and become an adult, and whatever happens, you mess up life, divorce, addiction, whatever, something happens.
Right.
You can go home.
Yeah.
And no matter what, even the richest, most like, I guess, hardliner, like tough parents will still ensure that their adult child, will have a few basic needs. They will have a roof over their head. They'll have some kind of transportation. They may not buy them a Lamborghini every time.
Right.
They might buy them a 2001 Honda Civic, but they'll give them something to get around in, or maybe a bus card, but it'll be something. Education if they want it, and healthcare. Their kid will always have those basic, because you cannot do well in your life and become the fullness of who you are or want to be without those basic needs met. It's wild to me that we understand this concept with everything else. If you have, I don't know, cattle, horses, dogs, whatever it is, you don't go, you know what, dog? I'm going to starve you. I'm not going to give you any water. And I need you to be the best dog you can be, because pull yourself up by those doggy bootstraps. Farmers don't go out and go, I have a field of corn. I'm not going to let it have any sunlight or water or fertilizer, and that'll make the best corn. You realize that all of these living entities need inputs in order to grow and be the healthiest, strongest things that they can be. But for some reason we have this, and I have my ideas about what the reason is, because it fits. It really helps people who are like the 1%, the people, the billionaire class, the owning class, this narrative that if we deny them as much as we can possibly deny them, then that will make them even better
Yeah.
because they'll be strong. It literally doesn't work for anything else. Um, what we have found, this idea that people won't work if you give them things, is completely false. The times when we were our most productive as a human species were times of plenty,
Yeah.
when people had. So the Renaissance, that's when we came into bumper crops and people had housing, because housing wasn't as like it is today. People
Hmm.
basically, even the most poor person had their own modest housing. And so, what you find is when people don't have to work so hard, yeah, if they've been working really hard, they might take some time. They might take a tick and rest and relax. And that's what we need. But human beings get bored. We are very active creatures. And so we start, you sit around like, I got food now, I got shelter. How
Yeah.
about these stars?
And that's when they started doing
How
science.
about,
That's when
right?
they
How about,
started.
how about paint? How about this piano? They
Hmm.
start creating, they start thinking, they start imagining and discovering and inventing. That's your Leonardo da Vinci's, right? those
Hmm.
those are your Michelangelos, where you're like, wow, now I have enough, I'm okay. What's next?
Yeah.
That's what it means to be human. And that gets back to my definition, just to tie it all up, of the left versus right. And you can talk about economics, what that means economically, or what that means on a civic scale, who has power, and your political compasses and whatnot. But really, what it is about is humanity,
Mm.
is understanding that I have to, as a member of our social species, because we are a social animal.
Hmm.
We inherently live in groups and help each other, and we do better as a result of living in groups than we do living alone. And that's how all social species, from ants to birds to what have you, operate. It is evolutionarily beneficial to behave in a mutually beneficial way together
Hmm.
as a group. And I, as a member of this social species, need to have empathy for my fellow members and understand that they have basic needs that they will need in order to be the best that they can be, to be the happiest, most productive, most enriched, fulfilled that we can be. And just honoring that without these narratives of, well, I'm good because I have money and you're bad because you don't, or I'm
Hmm.
good because, I have this title or this education or whatever, and you're bad because you don't. All these false narratives of worth that kind of somehow fill in a hole in our hearts, that like, maybe, I don't know, our parents didn't love us enough, but like, that idea that I'm better than you, and therefore I'm going to create these false narratives that you don't deserve basic needs being met, is kind of just this unnecessary, unhelpful concept. If you give everybody the light and the water and the fertilizer they need to grow,
Right.
they will grow.
Yeah.
And understanding that benefits everyone,
Hmm.
you know,
And
that's the difference,
one of the things you
because that
mentioned
creates
there,
equality.
absolutely, and one of the things you mentioned there that I think ties into my overall goals with the podcast here is you talked about how during the Enlightenment, right, that abundance gave people more time to do different things. I think that hopefully we're moving towards an era where we're more abundant, where technology is making things more abundant, and that allows us to spend maybe less time, manufacturing things or growing crops, doing physical things, and more time, I think, working smart instead of working hard. So more effort is going to be put in by the average person into things like politics and governance and how our society gets structured. I think more people today have that time now, hopefully, right? And they're going to be using that more and more to be more directly participatory in the government. So I want to create opportunity for that. I want to free people up a little bit from the hard work they do in their day-to-day lives, and I want to redirect some of that effort towards how can we restructure society to be more efficient. And I think one of the things that this podcast argues for a lot is liquid democracy. That's hence the name Liquid New Hampshire. And liquid democracy is partway between direct and representative
Oh,
democracy.
nice.
And so, because people have this more free time, one of the biggest questions is like, well, how can you get people to participate more? people aren't participating in politics very much,
I
you
think by
know.
design.
Yeah. So we need, for one thing, we need to remove barriers, but I also think that the answer to how do we get people to participate more directly is give them boredom. Give them
Give
some
them,
free time.
give us boredom. Exactly. Well, I think it is very intentional that, and if you permit me to go on another
Hmm.
little, get on my soapbox again. So we used to have chattel slavery in this country,
Hmm.
and chattel slaves uh, were brought to basically be exploited for free labor, as we understand. But because they were an investment as a worker, they were given meager housing, meager health care. They were given something, some
Hmm.
basic, very, very basic limited living. And when chattel slavery became unconstitutional, it's not that all those powerful interests who would exploit the powerless for free labor or cheap labor, it's not like they just all of a sudden had to change a heart,
Mm.
became better people or disappeared. They just figured out kind of legal ways to do the same exploitation. So now, yes, people are technically able to walk away from a job.
Hmm.
They're not chained, but they are effectively chained because instead of being given meager housing, meager health care, meager food, those things are denied
Hmm.
to the average worker. And instead, you have to work.
Yeah.
You have to work just to survive, just to live. And I think if if you're being forced to work half of all of your waking hours from the time your body is really still finally forming as an adult to the time your body's breaking down in old age, half of our waking hours,
Hmm.
and you're being forced to do all of that just to survive. Never mind, like, why are we here? Why are we alive? What are we supposed to be doing as human beings on this planet? You can't even think about those things. You're just trying to survive.
Hmm.
At that point, work is no longer an economic opportunity, it's exploitation, it's coercion.
Hmm.
Um, and so I think I have so many little threads of thought. But the point is, what if we did give people all of those things? Everything that we were talking about, the healthcare, the food, the housing, the education. And, maybe they put in some hours. I did, for my master's degree, a bunch of natural resource courses. One of them focused on what was called solar economy. And it's
Okay.
instead of everything being broken down into dollars,
Hmm.
everything originally all energy comes from the sun.
Hmm.
So instead of the cost of a house being, whatever many dollars, it's, how much solar energy went into the wood planks, how much solar energy went into the food that fed the number of workers that built the house.
Yeah.
You can calculate everything in terms of solar energy. And what they found out is that a person only needs to work
Hmm.
about 16 hours a week to meet their basic needs,
Yeah.
which means all the work you're doing past that is just making someone somewhere richer. And if it's not you, if you're just meeting your basic needs at 40
Hmm.
hours, 50 hours, 60 hours a week, and you're just meeting basic needs, then that means that wealth that you're generating past the 16 hours is making someone else richer.
I think it's funny that you were aware of that very specific idea. I know about that, the solar energy idea there. One of the first people to write about that, interestingly, is I think it was Life in a Technate by Harold Loeb. Have you heard of that?
No.
The term technocracy, if you've ever heard anybody
Yes.
use that term, originates from a very specific movement of people. They were a very odd group. They were kind of socialists, but very, very central in all of their ideas. They wanted to like take all of the federal land and water, for example, and put it under a single trust that was controlled centrally. And they thought that that would be so abundant that they could provide everybody's basic needs with that. And they came up with a lot of unique ideas, and I think that came from them. Because
Ah.
they talked a lot about like measuring the economy based on natural energy, like solar energy, instead of through money. And that's where the term technocracy comes from. Even though today most of the technocrat advocates that I know who have that strong emphasis on expertise that those original thinkers had tend to be more right wing, actually, a lot of the time, or maybe more in the center politically.
Well, I find that very educated, kind of intelligent people who really think deeply about these things kind of drift towards more independent parties or groups
Mm.
anyway. So that makes sense. But yeah, so what if we did just give? Right now, we have a system where we are literally, living to work, right? And it's like all of our half of our waking hours, and you notice that as our pay might go up, the cost of living increases even more. So we're
Hmm.
always kept at that desperate level, always kept where we're just keeping our head above water, not drowning so much that we revolt, but also not succeeding because, what happens when people have free time? Well, we kind of just saw this happen a few years ago. 2020, all of a sudden, nobody's going to work,
Right.
and millions of people flooded the streets with the very first big newsworthy event that required systemic change.
Mm.
We saw people knew that Black people were being murdered in the streets by cops. We've known it for decades. We've
Hmm.
known it for decades. The stats have been there. And then you see it happen, and nobody's going to work. And then we went into the streets and we made a fuss. And that's exactly what they don't want. Like, they don't want us filling the streets and
Hmm.
being more involved in our in our democracy and in our self-governance. And so that's why they keep us right at that level where we're not going to revolt because literally nothing's, we're not meeting even our basic needs, which I think we're kind of rapidly getting to that point. But we're also not doing so well that we have extra free time.
Mm.
Um, but imagine that all those needs are met now and you do have that free time. Like, you can actually learn a language, pick up a musical instrument,
Right.
you know, study quantum physics. You can, deepen your relationships, travel.
Yeah.
You can work on yourself, you can be human.
Mm.
You can decide what is meaningful and edifying and purposeful in your life and actually live your life
Hmm.
instead of literally living to work. Um, right now, because you brought up technology, I do agree with you that
Hmm.
I think we're going to get to a level of advancement. It's going to require deep systemic change because right now, when we talk about automation, robots, AI, people get really scared because in our current structure,
Hmm.
which is kind of wild if you think about it, these things are considered a threat
Yeah.
because
Let's
they're going to
do your
make us
job.
jobless.
Hmm.
Now, imagine for a second, because only a very perverted system can make a gift of automating the basic menial tasks of life, making that automated and freeing us up. Only a perverted system can make that a negative,
Hmm.
right? Only a perverted system can do that. We know from all of the technology we have at our disposal that it actually benefits us. So imagine a village right now. In the village, very basic tribe, and they go out and they fish and they hunt and they garden, and that's what they do all day long to survive. And now, little space aliens come and have dropped down robots, whatever, whatever analogy you want. We won't talk about like the History Channel or anything.
Yeah.
Drop down little robots that do all of that for them.
Hmm.
That village sees that as a benefit. They're like, wow,
Yeah.
I don't have to supply my own food.
Right.
What do I do now? And then that village all of a sudden discovers,
In our
math.
society, we would probably shoot the aliens down from the sky, and we'd be like, "What are you doing? That's my job."
So we understand, even at a basic level, that having those tasks being done
Yeah.
for us frees us up to do more important, meaningful things that
Mm.
edify our lives. We understand that. But
Right.
in our system, we actually penalize that and make people suffer as a result. So I think we're going to get to the point, and I know anybody who knows Star Trek lore will see similarities that, like, really there's just, not enough menial work to go around to start shaming people as to why they're
Mm.
not working,
Right.
because there's just not enough menial work to go around. And I guess we're just going to have to, what are we going to do? Let half the population starve,
Mm.
Or we actually start building a system that goes that instead of this idea of profit, this arbitrary idea of money, solar energy is a real thing.
Hmm.
Money is this made up thing. We started with shells, then we found some shiny metal and we're like, maybe it's the metal. It's just this made up thing that doesn't have actual worth. but solar energy does. And instead of like dedicating our entire system to this made up thing that then we use to pummel people over the head to tell them that they're worthless because they're not working harder,
Mm-hmm.
crack the whip, you know, um, that maybe we just build a system that honors our humanity and treats us all. I hate to say it, but like the children we are
Mm.
all, I don't care if you're 80 years old, we're
Right.
all just trying to figure out life.
Mm-hmm.
We're all just trying to figure out, we all just need, you know, our food, our water, our basic love, dignity, shelter, healthcare. We all need the same things, and we should be treating each other like we're human beings.
In regards to the technology that you mentioned earlier, the fact that in our current society, technology is something that we're afraid of when it should be something that we welcome. That's an area where I actually start to be maybe a little bit conservative about. For example, when I went to New Jersey, I was surprised that there were people there that were pumping my gas for me, right? And I asked, well, what's going on there? And it turned out that it was a government program that was designed to help employ some people who were unemployed. It was designed to create jobs. And I'm like, okay, but clearly we've decided that that's kind of not a very useful job, right? That's why we just pump it ourselves,
Right.
right? And I'm like, we decided that that's not really a job that's worth having in the economy anymore.
So how
So
about just give them money?
yeah,
Like,
exactly.
or the
And
food and housing.
and so I think actually there's probably a lot of government waste actually on programs like that that maybe actually could be cut and replaced with other programs
Oh,
that are helping
100%.
people more directly.
100%. The conservatives, please don't read too much into this, but
Mm-hmm.
they have a point about government waste.
Mm-hmm.
But what they often fail to recognize, I think, because and I've said this from the floor of the House repeatedly, the traditional wisdom is liberals, if you want to say liberals, consider the problem to be corporations,
Mm-hmm.
and conservatives consider the problem to be government. And in reality, who is actually calling the shots in government? It's not the people, it's the corporations, it's money and politics.
Mm-hmm.
They're, you know, a billionaire who owns a major energy company or tech company is going to have a lot more sway than either of us, even with me in my state title.
Mm-hmm.
So, really, the problem is that corporations and government are one and the same.
Mm.
And so when conservatives sit here and go, look at all the government waste, I'm like, yeah, those are your buddies that you keep defending.
Mm-hmm.
That's those monies are going to big company tax breaks and subsidies for, you know, big industry and industries that we don't need,
Mm-hmm.
fossil fuel industries, for example. So there is a lot of military. Let's not get started on what takes up half of our discretionary budget every year is
Mm. Yeah.
killing little brown kids on the other side
Tell
of the
me
planet.
about some of that in New Hampshire. What are some things in New Hampshire along those lines?
What we'll see, we don't have a lot of revenue.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of, I can't say that I see a lot of waste in the
Mm.
sense of programs that shouldn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
We did cut taxes for businesses, which I didn't think
Mm-hmm.
we needed to do. But what I do see is not that the programs shouldn't exist, but that the programs that we have are not effective
Mm-hmm.
because they're underfunded.
Mm.
And I see that our overall tax scheme that we have in this state is predominantly dependent on the most regressive tax that we have, which is property tax.
Yes.
Property tax. I mean, conservatives complain a lot about some income tax, though, but at least it's a progressive tax that doesn't
Mm-hmm.
tax poor people out of their ability to live. In theory, anyway. It could be more progressive, but
Mm.
I digress. Property tax, in the way that we do it, literally, you could be gifted a home and be unable to live in it because of the property, all of our taxes being downshifted onto the towns, meaning the towns have to come up with all the money predominantly for schooling, because if the state took care of it and it really was like every student, no matter where they lived, got the same education level,
Mm-hmm.
then we would have better outcomes. But also the towns wouldn't have to come up with approximately half of their property taxes, or even more than. So instead, you could be living in a hut, a hovel, and still paying the same percentage on your house value
Mm-hmm.
that a millionaire pays, which is why rich people love moving to New Hampshire,
Mm.
because they pay less in property tax on their McMansion than they would pay in income tax in another state, like Massachusetts. So I've to that end, I've put in, as I said, I've put in many housing bills, including helping people buy. If you're in a lower budget for housing, and really there is no lower budget anymore, but if you're low income and you're trying to buy a house, approximately, when you actually run the numbers of what you're going to be paying every month, and that property tax is being escrowed, about half of your monthly payment isn't the actual mortgage,
Mm.
it's the property taxes.
Yeah.
And that means it doubles what you have to spend to buy a home. So, and that's aside from all the other costs to buying the home, like, state transfer tax and all those things I would like to
Mm.
see eased up on low to moderate income people. So what I did is I put in a bill that it would simply go to the town ballot of every town for their town meeting,
Okay.
and it would change. I worked with a mathematician who's the dean of his mathematics department at his
Okay.
college. It would change the property tax from a regressive system, which right now is flat, so you're paying the same percentage even if you're fabulously wealthy as if you're in a hovel,
Mm-hmm.
to a progressive tax structure using a formula. And the
Yeah.
formula was a means tested property tax exemption.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a homestead exemption.
Yeah.
And I know conservatives love homestead
They
exemptions.
do.
So
They
yeah.
they they just voted. I just listened to them voting in favor of a specific homestead exemption bill recently in the state house.
Oh, they got nothing on my homestead exemptions, because mine would actually mean that people could live
Yeah.
in their homes. So the way this formula works, and it's a town by town basis. So
Yeah.
it would only happen if the townspeople voted to make this their new taxation structure.
Uh-huh.
But if it happened, there would be an exemption, a tax exemption. And the way it's formulated is you qualify for the exemption if your household income
Mm-hmm.
is less than the last year's town median household income. So it's
Mhm.
very town by town based. A
Right.
rich town will have a different level than a poor town. And your house assessment is at or below the median townhouse assessment.
Mhm.
So basically, we're saying you're either doing as well as the average person in this town, or you'll get some tax exemption.
Okay.
How much? And it has to be the only home that you own.
Mhm.
So no vacation homes. And
Mhm.
so how much will the exemption be? So you subtract the cost of, or the assessment of your house from the median, because you're below the median.
Mhm.
And then whatever that difference is, you get the first part of your home value tax free.
Yeah.
So if your town median is $300,000, which rapidly that's becoming low end at this
Mhm.
point. But let's say your town median is a $300,000 house. Your house is $200,000.
Mhm.
$100,000 is the difference. That means you get the first $100,000 of your property tax free.
Mm.
And the wonderful thing is that, normally you would tear your hair out going, well, that means that the wealthier people and people who own more than one property, and the business people who own business property, would have to make up the difference. Well, yes, but there's such a thing as a tax base and a width of tax base. And this is where I worked with the mathematician. And I
Okay.
apologize for getting a little geeky here.
No, please
but if you
do.
imagine a typical bell curve distribution of values,
Mhm.
right? It turns out property taxes or assessments are like one of the few things that don't naturally follow that bell curve.
Okay.
Okay, so if your median's 300,000,
Mhm.
in that same town, you will definitely have on the high end of that bell curve, $600,000 houses, $1 million houses. So that there's
Oh.
area, but you don't have a $0 house on the other side of that bell curve. You don't
Okay.
have a negative $700,000
The
house.
entire curve is sloped on the high side.
Exactly. So
Mhm.
that tax base, because those properties are so assessed so highly,
Okay.
that tax base is so huge compared to the low end.
Mhm.
Because of that, the tax increase that you need to increase on the wealthier half of that community is extremely negligible. I'm sure that they won't say it's negligible, because there are people who are opposed to any increase.
Right.
But I can tell you, I, as a relatively poor person, would gladly pay. It came out to about like taking someone out to like lunch, a nice lunch once a
Hmm.
month. And I would
Wow.
gladly take you out to lunch once a month if it meant half of my community could own their home.
That is absolutely perfect because I have been talking to a lot of people in the state about this issue. Conservatives and liberals alike talk about property taxes
It's the most hated
as a key
tax.
issue in New Hampshire. And I have not, I'm somebody who tends towards localism, generally speaking. I generally prefer local control, which I'm told is typically conservative.
It's
Uh,
changing rapidly.
and so, because of that, I'm not a big fan of all of the solutions I'm being told about being primarily centralizing and redistributing from one neighborhood to another. And I've often asked myself, aren't there ways to change the tax system in these local governments to be more progressive on a community by community basis, to redistribute more gradually within every community so this inequality doesn't start and form in the first place? And that sounds perfect because it sounds like you are leaving it up to the towns, and it's up to the towns to do something progressive that changes their property taxes. That's perfectly in
The
line.
only thing, so the towns can do it right now.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have to do anything to
Right.
enable the towns to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Towns inherently are in charge, the townspeople, meaning, are
Right.
in charge of their taxation. Inherently, it's a wonderful thing about our democracy,
Mm-hmm.
specifically in New England and in New Hampshire. What my bill did was simply send it to every town meeting
Mm.
ballot
Yeah.
so that people
Put
would
it
be given the
forward.
opportunity. But anyone that's watching this, you in your town can literally get it on your ballot with just 25 signatures. And I'm happy. I will give
Ooh,
you my contact information. I'm happy to help anybody with that language.
I can get 25. That's a small number.
Well, it's different in bigger cities because
Okay.
if you have a town council or a city council form of government,
Mm.
then it's going to be slightly different.
Well,
But
I am in Goffstown. I'm not sure if that's
I'm,
not
I
a
don't
big
know. It's
city,
like it might
right?
be an SB2. I don't know what type of town it is, but
Okay.
in most what they call traditional towns,
Mm-hmm.
all you need is 25 signatures to get anything on the town warrant.
Absolutely. So we're nearing, I think, an hour. We're a little bit over an hour of the interview. This was a
I told
great
you I talk a
interview.
lot.
We clearly have much to talk about. Is there anything you want to talk about your campaign, or anything you want to plug, a website or anything like that before the end of the interview?
Yeah, I'm really terrible at social media. I go through different volunteers that help me with it. So my social media is fairly sporadic, but I have a great volunteer right now who's putting up some of my speeches. I give a lot of speeches. I think you may have picked up on the fact that I like to talk. But if you go to ellen4nh.com, the number four, ELLEN, number four, NH.com. So that's my website, but also it connects with all my social media, which is also the same handle. Every single social media account is Ellen4NH.
Okay.
I'm helping that site get updated as well. The last time I updated was 2 years ago, but all the information and certainly my contact information is there. My email is Ellen4NH, once again, at gmail.com. And I'll give out my cell if that's cool.
Absolutely.
352-978-7692.
Okay. I can put that in the description as well. That will be in the description for anyone who wants to contact her.
Perfect. Anyone is welcome to text or call. And I'm working with like a deaf veteran in Nashua right now who saw my housing stuff. But
Oh, great.
yeah, so people, planet, principles, housing, economic justice. Planet's pretty self-explanatory. I do a lot of animal stuff. I won Humane Society's Legislator of the Year as well as Voices of Wildlife's Legislator of the Year.
Mm-hmm.
And Principles is all about that electoral reform, election day holiday, ranked choice voting, campaign finance reform, national popular vote to overcome the electoral college, those things.
Absolutely.
So that's who I am.
Great.
Before profit. People, planets, principles, before profit.
That's in parentheses.
Squeeze it in.
Well, thank you for coming on. This was a great interview.
It was wonderful. Thank you.